Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. So, we are here, and you might be wondering if you're watching the video on YouTube, you might be wondering where we are. We are in my greenhouse. If you've read my book, you'll know, which is linked in the description below. You'll know that I'm a big plant fan, especially tropical plants. So, this is where we keep them during the winter. So, we are in here. It's kind of cold in here. I thought we'd get a bit of a change of scenery. So it's only about 44 degrees in here. That's why I'm wearing gloves. So if I start to shiver a little bit, you'll know what's going on. So anyway, let's get right into it. Before we begin, let me remind everybody that we are on YouTube, we are on Spotify, and we are on Apple Podcasts. It's the same content. It's just YouTube has a video. If that's what you prefer, then we have that available here. Not every episode is videoed, but it is I try to do about half of them these days. And if you are on YouTube and you're not subscribed, please do so. That would be great. If we could get my subscriber numbers up a little bit, that would be greatly appreciated. And I also want to begin with a minor correction. I say minor because it's not really a correction. I wasn't really wrong earlier. Instead, I want to add some context that I think is really important. Unlike the mainstream media, I'm going to say it at the top and not at the end. And what I said in the last episode, we were talking about housing prices. And I said that large companies have been buying up lots of houses and they've been raising the housing prices. Except that's not entirely true. They have been buying houses, but out of all the U.S. inventory stock, they own only about 0.5% of all the houses, which is not enough to change prices nationwide. So it shows, as I have been advocating, that it is really a supply problem where we need to be building more houses. In fact, we need to build about 20 to 25 million houses in order to catch up with the population. So just wanted to put that out there. So on with this episode. This episode, we are going to be covering the first year of the Trump administration and some of their achievements and failures in their first year in office. Since there's a lot to cover, I'm going to be splitting this episode into two. This week, we're going to cover domestic policy. Next week, we're going to cover foreign and trade policy. So a lot has happened. You probably need a reminder. Let's take a time machine. Let's bring our minds back to December of 2024, which is about 16 months ago. And this was when Trump started talking about annexing Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, and except for the latter, none of these things have actually happened, except the renaming of the Gulf, as I said. And Trump had that meeting in December, or it might have been late November, with Justin Trudeau, the then Prime Minister of Canada, which irked so many people in Canada, they got rid of him and replaced him with another boring old man. But that's beside the point. More recently, the administration has renewed its efforts in Greenland, and I explained some of the problems with the timeline of that and how that would work in the last episode. So if you haven't listened to the last episode, I recommend you do that. We will get into, so it's not really an achievement, annexing Greenland, because it hasn't happened, but we will get into that in the next episode. Let's start with the loss. Well, there hasn't been much of significance, except because most of what the president has been done by executive fiat. There's two major laws, and one really isn't even a major law, it's just a law, and that's the Laken-Riley Act. This was signed about a year ago. It was, I believe, at the end of January in 2025. This is the first law that the Trump administration signed. It was named after a woman who was murdered by an illegal alien during the Biden administration, and they were an illegal alien that already had several crimes on his rap sheet beside being an illegal alien. And by the way, here's a lesson for everybody. Even it is not true that entering the country illegally is not a crime. That is absolutely wrong. You've heard that from the mainstream media so many times. That is not true. And even if it wasn't true, and somebody, maybe you're listening to this, if you came into the country illegally or you overstayed your visa and you are working while you're an illegal immigrant, you are committing a crime. If you are collecting benefits while working or not working as an illegal immigrant, you are committing a crime. If you have decided to steal someone's social security number to work, you are committing a crime. It is basically impossible to be in this country and be an illegal immigrant while not committing an additional crime, because you can't do anything. If you have a fake ID or using a fake name, that is a crime. If you have been ordered to be deported and you haven't left, you're committing a crime. So it's pretty obvious you're going to be committing extra crimes. And besides that, coming into the country illegally is still a crime. Anyway, I don't want to get onto that. So this law was signed into effect. It was put into effect, and this will require the Homeland Security Secretary to take custody of illegal aliens who have been charged with even petty crimes. And unlike Trump's executive orders, this is a law. It has been written in stone, and the only way to undo it would be for Congress to pass a new law and for another president to undo it, which there's no reason Democrats would want to undo this. No reason. It would be politically toxic. In my opinion, out of all the things that Trump has done with executive order, this probably could have been done via executive order. Anyway, 17,500 people, illegal aliens, have been arrested under this act, which, if Kamala Harris had won the presidency, would likely still be in our country. But those people have been deported or under the way, the process to deport them is underway. So this is a huge success of the Trump administration. Secondly, there is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's basically the only other law that they've passed. That is a monumental piece of legislation. And I would say in terms of scale and scope, and definitely cost, it matches the Biden administration's American Rescue Plan, which he passed in 2021. We talked about this before over the spring and the summer, every turn, nook, and cranny. We talked a lot about that. It did way more than just maintain taxes at current levels. And that was a huge deal for the president, so I'll explain some of the big stuff in the bill and then explain my thoughts as always. The biggest piece of was the extension of the 2017 tax cuts. It created a new deduction for qualified overtime pay and qualified tip income. Remember, there's no tax on tips or overtime. That was a big campaign promise of both the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign. There's taxable deductions on U.S. assembled cars, an increase to the SALT limit, the state and local tax deduction to $40,000, which I'm against, but story for another time. Tax credit for Social Security, so there isn't no taxes on Social Security, but there is a credit, which is a better way to do it. And there's a tax credit for educators who buy their own supplies for their classroom. It's a shame that that happens, but here we are. There's enhanced child tax credits of $2,200, a child adoption tax credit. There is the elimination of the clean energy tax cuts and a 1% remittance tax on U.S. foreign countries that when somebody sends money to another country who's via electronic means, and that is taxed at 1%. No more sending money overseas without paying taxes. There's also higher estate and gift tax limits. And that's only the individual stuff. The business stuff is even more expansive. Then you have the tax on college endowments for colleges with more than 3,000 students at a rate of 1.4%. Reversing Medicare negotiations of certain drugs, which is going to cost all of us more, unfortunately. The infamous Medicaid and SNAP restrictions, which includes work requirements of 80 hours a month. Check eligibility. Instead of every 6 months, instead of every 12 months, they do it every 6 months. Removing premium tax cuts for illegal immigrants. Tax credits for illegal immigrants, preventing Medicaid from being used for funding Planned Parenthood for 1 year until July 2026, and maintain a bunch of other stuff as well. Rural hospitals got $50 billion. The so-called Trump account tax savings of investment accounts, they are being rolled out for every child born between January 1st of this year and December 31st of 2028. There's a raise to the debt ceiling. It allocated $150 billion to the military, $170 billion for border security, and it raised the capacity to deport up to 1 million illegal aliens a year. And that includes funding for the wall, more migrant detention beds, more ICE agents, hiring more border patrol agents, border technology, immigration judges, and staff. And except for the amount of illegal aliens entering our country, the immigration situation really has not changed in terms of numbers since the end of the Biden administration to today. And what do I mean by that? The amount of deportations is basically the same. So the amount of people who are entering our country illegally has dropped dramatically. It's almost zero. And that's serious. We're talking about the hundreds and thousands as opposed to the tens of thousands and the hundreds of thousands. So you have fewer people coming in, but the amount of deportations is about the same. It's a little higher, but it's not that much higher, which, if you ask me, is really impressive because it shows they're actually going into the country and finding more illegal aliens and sending them out, as opposed to having people come in and then you immediately deport them. So we're making progress there, but at the same time, the total numbers have not really changed, at least with deportations. So the administration is way short of its goal to deport every single illegal alien ASAP. There's also more domestic stuff. There's a 529 plan to allow the distributions of funds for cost of attending secondary education other than college, tax credits for employers who provide childcare for their employees, an increase to the amount of money one can put in a flexible savings account per year, tax credit for employers who pay their staff at least 50% of their wages while they are on Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, which is a big deal because FMLA is guaranteed leave in America, but it's not paid leave. It was passed in the 90s under Bill Clinton. You can get up to 12 weeks of unpaid vacation time. Well, not vacation. It's leave time, but it's unpaid, unlike in other countries where it's paid. Really, if I was the Democratic candidate in 2028, I would say we're going to make that paid. That's going to be my big pitch. That would be my big pitch. And is that a good idea? I would think so. Of course, there's consequences. Conservatives would be against it, but it would be a very popular policy. The bill goes on, and I've only scratched the surface. This is clearly a big win for the president because it included funding for almost all of his major campaign promises of the last few elections, not just 2024. It includes funding for the border wall, no tax on tips or Social Security. And it's going to greatly help Republicans in the coming years in theory because older Americans vote at much higher rates. There are concerns, of course, and that a lot of these benefits are going to the highest earners. And the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the highest 10% of earners would see their wealth rise by 2.7%, and the lowest 10% fall by 3.1%. However, pollsters at the time of the passage of the bill showed that Americans were deeply opposed to it. Pew Research, Fox News, Ipsos Washington, and the Kaiser Family Foundation all found that the bill was deeply unpopular. And I opposed the bill because when it was announced over the spring, it was shown that it would cost $2.8 trillion over 10 years, which is $280 billion a year, and is a deeply regressive bill that will take our social policy back decades. However, if you're a Republican or a Trump fan, this is undoubtedly a huge win, and there are good aspects of the bill, like funding rural hospitals that are already in crisis, and that had been since even before the pandemic. And I also want to point out what hasn't been accomplished this year, and I think the list has some very, very important conservative items on the agenda that if you're a Republican or a part of the MAGA movement, you would be very disappointed by. If you're a Democrat, you consider these failures to be good because they weren't put into place. So Republicans did not pass voter ID laws. There was an executive order, but that is being challenged in court. There is no ban on gender-affirming mutilation care. An executive order was signed, but that only lasts until Gavin Newsom becomes president and undoes it. Obamacare has not been repealed. Illegal aliens can still get driver's licenses in a third of the states in this country. Congressional men and women can still trade stocks while in office. That hasn't been banned yet. There's been no effort to cap, well, actually, there has been an effort to cap interest rates on loans. When I wrote the script, that wasn't the case. Now there is. It is something that the president has signed. I'll get to that in a moment. But there's very little to reduce government spending or the deficit. And in fact, the One Big Beautiful Bill makes it even worse. And I think most importantly, there's been basically nothing except the tax cuts to ease the cost of living. And I was reading a really interesting article in the Wall Street Journal where it showed that what's going on is the president is basically just juicing up the economy. And you might think, well, isn't that a good thing? Juicing up the economy, it's what you want to do. Well, the problem with that is you risk overheating it and causing inflation. So how is he overheating the economy? One, he's trying to get interest rates lowered. He hasn't been successful. We'll have to wait and see. He's been trying to undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve. Then he's been trying to tax cuts to give Americans more money. Sounds good, but when you're in a time of inflationary environment like we just left, that is bad. Then lastly, he's been trying to get Americans to spend more money by reducing their credit card interest rates. And that might sound like a good thing, but you risk making inflation go up in the years ahead. So that is where we are at the moment. Trump did recently announce that he would sign a rule and that Congress would have to pass it, and that would be to lower interest rates on credit cards for 1 year to 10%. And I think what's really interesting is about 3.5 years ago, no, it was about 2.5 years ago, Joe Biden announced his student loan forgiveness scam, and that was considered among the GOP base to be rigging votes, buying votes, rigging elections. But this, it's only going to last a year. It's going to run out a couple weeks after the midterm elections. That's not buying votes. If you ask me, they're both the same. And I've already explained why that's a bad idea for lots of different reasons. Check out last episode. But what is interesting is that if he does try to get this passed without Congress, if he tries to do it without congressional approval, he would need the agencies, he would need the executive branch, the federal government, to back him up. And if he's going to do that, his challenge is going to be that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau would be the one that would be helping him do this, and he's gutted it. So we're in a situation where the president wants to do something, but he's gutted the federal government so badly that they're not going to be able to implement it effectively. So that's one of the many contradictions of this administration. Anyway, as I said, there's really no cost of living problem easing, no real way to ease the cost of living. And you might think, well, why is that so important? Well, that's the reason he got into office in the first place. If Republicans have any shot at holding on to Congress, they got to pivot to the economy, pivot away from immigration and toward the economy. So I would think that they could sell federal land, especially on the West Coast, to build more houses or do more drilling for oil. The West Coast has a ton of federal land, and about 30% of the country is owned by the federal government. It could be used to rapidly build homes for people. And speaking of homes, the president did announce his plan to ban big companies from buying homes. Not going to work, really, as I explained at the beginning. And another thing that I think could have a long-term effect, well, this would have a short-term effect. What I mentioned earlier would have more of a long-term effect. Short-term effect would be to require hospitals and insurances to disclose cash prices to make it easier for people to shop around. So you can say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to get my scan here instead of here because it's cheaper. Right now, no law requiring that. Most hospitals don't do that. And then another thing I think would be to fast track other infrastructure projects. Tell state and local governments, if you want federal funding, you need to cut approval times in half. Then there's a few other things that these things are going to require long-term thinking. For example, you're not going to sell federal land and have a house up by November, but people who own homes tend to be more conservative because they have something that's worth conserving. And it's correlation causation thing here. But it's no secret that younger people who can't afford anything tend to be more liberal. And lastly, and I think this is more difficult in theory than it is in practice, I've never seen anybody actually mention this in ways that people can understand, charge employers for the cost of public benefits used by full-time employees. And I think you'd have support on the left from this. If someone is working full-time and they are on benefits, the employer should be paying those benefits, not the state. Of course, this should only apply to large corporations, so it doesn't hurt small businesses. But for example, Walmart should not be paying its employees $30,000 a year, and then the government subsidizing their rent and their food and their childcare. Should not be happening. Their employer should be paying for that. That's easy. Let's end corporate welfare, and that can dramatically reduce the size of the state, which is what Republicans want. So companies will be forced to choose either we pay them a better wage, or the government is going to charge us more money in taxes to make up the shortfall. That's an interesting idea. Don't know how you do it in practice. Haven't heard any politician mention it, but I'd like to see it happen. And I think this story, lastly, the story of the president's first year in office is always the opinion polling. And judging by this, it is very, very bad. If not worse than Joe Biden, it is worse than Joe Biden. His approval rating has been negative since March, and except for a few weeks after Liberation Day in April, it really dropped off starting in the summer, and then it plateaued, and then it continued to drop, and it really fell off a cliff after the government shutdown began. As of right now, according to the Silver Bulletin, his approval rating is at -12, which is quite low for a president. And at this point in his first term, he was at -16, so it's a slight improvement. At this point in his first term, Barack Obama was at +5. In his second term, a year from his second inauguration, he was at -11. President Biden was at -13 in his first term. Obviously, he never got a second term. President Bush in his first term was at +66, although that was after 9/11. And in his second term, he was at -9. So those are numbers. The last few numbers are from Real Clear Politics polling average. So Trump is in line with presidents in the past years in terms of the headline numbers. However, each midterm, 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, 2022, to some extent were not good for the sitting president. And also, if you look at a chart for all those previous presidents, their approval rating drops from here. It goes down, 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 down. It might go up a little bit, like I think Obama's did. He did recover a little bit after the 2010 and 2014 midterms, and that's the exception, not the rule. Bush, Trump won, and Biden all went down, 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 down. So I think the president is going downhill from here. So in that sense, it has been a huge failure. Lastly, we talk about immigration, and this is going to help us transition into next episode as we move to international affairs. I believe immigration has been the biggest success of the second Trump administration, even more so than the first Trump administration. However, the public deeply disagree with me on this one. His approval rating on immigration is -8, which, considering that's his very best issue, is very, very, very low. It should at least be in positive single digits, like it was for most of last year. And the administration did report, and I consider this to be a big win, there was 2 million people who left our country via self-deportation or actual deportation. So really, how do I grade Trump's first year? I'm going to give it, it's hard to say because we haven't gotten into foreign affairs yet, but I would say just the domestic things, I would give it a D. It's been pretty bad. There's been very little that's been done. I think most Republicans should be very furious with the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress because, as I said last episode, they have no plan to pass any major bills. So all those things I mentioned, banning gender mutilation surgeries, defunding Planned Parenthood, repealing Obamacare, things like that, child voter ID laws, preventing illegal aliens from getting driver's licenses, they're not going to be able to do any of that. And that's would be a big priority for Republicans. That's something that if they don't do it, will never get done. So in that sense, it's been a big failure. I think in terms of illegal immigration, getting those numbers down, that is really the only success. And if it wasn't for that, in terms of domestic affairs, it would be an F. And I hate to say that. I was really hopeful. As I said at the beginning on this show, I said about a year ago, I felt fairly optimistic. And now I'm not. But at the same time, as we kind of transition into the next episode, which will be out a week from today, that I'm not convinced that Democrats are going to be able to do a lot better. Their vision for the country is completely discombobulated, which is normal because they don't have a candidate yet. But if they're going to go back to the old Biden vision, then in truth, I'd rather stick with what we got right now. So, hate to say that, but I'm very disappointed in our politicians. I'm never somebody who has had high expectations for them, but this is very, very low. I think many people, when Trump came into office, they had this high bar. Mine was all the way down here. It was way, way, way down here, and somehow we still didn't even crawl over that bar. So that's all for this episode. If you liked it and you liked the greenhouse, maybe I'll have to show you around here in a little someday. But if you like the greenhouse and you like this episode, thank you so much. And please let me know your thoughts, as always, in the comments below. So have a great week and see you next week. Bye-bye.